Welcome to the podcast where we explore the latest trends in technology and how they impact our lives. In today's episode, we'll be discussing the pros and cons of microservices and monoliths in backend development. Microservice and monoliths are two popular architectures used in building software systems. Each architecture has its own advantages and disadvantages, and choosing the right one for your backend can be challenging. By the end of this episode, you will have a better understanding of the differences between these architectures and which one is better suited for your needs. Let's start by defining what microservices and monoliths are. A monolithic architecture is an application built as a single self contained unit. All the components of the application are tightly coupled and run in the same process. In contrast, a microservice architecture is an application built as a collection of small independent services which and each with its own business function. These services can communicate with each other through APIs and can be developed, deployed, and scaled independently. So, which architecture is better suited for your backend application? The answer depends on several factors, such as the size and complexity of the application, the development team's expertise, and the business requirement. Let's explore the advantages and disadvantages of each architecture in more detail. Let's start with monolithic architecture. One of the main advantages of monolithic architecture is that it's simple to develop and deploy. Since all the components are tightly coupled, it is easier to test and debug the application. Also, scaling a monolithic application is straightforward since all the components are running in the same process. However, there are also some disadvantages of monolithic architecture. As the application grows in size and complexity, it becomes harder to maintain and deploy. The development team has to work on the entire code base, which can slow down the development process. Also, since all the components are tightly coupled, making changes to one component can affect the entire application, making it harder to add new feature or fix bugs. Let's move on to microservice architecture. One of the main advantage of microservice is that each service is independent and can be deployed, developed, and scaled independently. This means that development team can work on each services separately, which speeds up the development process. Also, since each service has its own business function, it is easier to maintain and debug the application. However, there are also some disadvantages of microservices. Developing a microservice application is a more complex since it requires designing and implementing APIs to allow communication between the services. Also, testing and debugging a application is more challenging since each service has its own dependency. Finally, scaling a microservice application requires more sophisticated infrastructure since each service needs to be able to handle increased traffic independently. So now again question arises, which architecture is better suited for your backend? It depends on your specific needs. If you are building a small to medium sized application and don't have large development team, a monolithic architecture might be the right choice for you. It is simple to develop and deploy, and scaling the application is straightforward. However, if you are building a large and complex application with large development team, a microservice architecture might be the better choice because it allows for independent development and deployment of each service, making it easier to maintain and debug the application. In conclusion, both microservice and monolithic architecture have their own advantage and disadvantage Choosing the right architecture for your backend depends on your specific needs and requirements. Before making a decision, it is important to carefully evaluate the size and complexity of your application, the expertise of your development team, and your business requirement. Before we wrap up, let's take a look at some real world example of companies that have successfully implemented both architecture. Netflix is a well known example of a company that has adopted a microservice architecture. Netflix system is made up of hundreds of small services that are developed, deployed, and scaled independently. This allows Netflix to handle the enormous amount of traffic they receive and allows them to roll out new features quickly. On the other hand, Shopify is an example of a company that has adopted a monolithic architecture. Shopify is an e-commerce platform that allows merchants to sell their products online. Shopify's monolithic architecture allows them to handle a large number of transactions and allows for easy scaling of the application. These are just a couple of examples of how both architecture can be successful when implemented correctly. Ultimately, the success of your backend architecture will depend on your specific needs and business requirements. That's it for today's episode. We hope you find this discussion informative and helping in choosing the right architecture for your backend. If you have any questions or comment, feel free to reach out to me on social media. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast for more episodes like this. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you the next time.